Good afternoon and welcome to the June 26, 2024 City Council Work Session. Thank you for joining us in this virtual meeting format. For work sessions like this one where there is no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcasts and meeting materials web page. Thank you again for joining us. And with that, I call this June 26, 2024 City Council Work Session to order, and I will turn it over to the City Manager to introduce our one and only and very important topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. It's good to be here, and I'm really excited about this topic. This is the second of kind of more of a workshop-y format where we take a deeper dive into some of the things you identified in your strategic, goal setting and strategic planning you wanted to know more about. So this one really actually hits two different areas. One of our focus areas was addressing urgent community needs, and one of the goals under there was actually advancing climate action and increasing our community's resilience to natural and human-made kind of disasters. So kind of hitting that mark, and then also under the communication and outreach, really helping our community understand priority topics. So taking a little bit more time, being able to do this in a way that they can listen in is also hitting that goal. So we're going to dive deep into emergency management, or we're going to dive into it at some level. And I think it's being kicked off by Mia and Chief Caven, I believe.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm actually going to hand it over to Jen Yildiz Vanderhagen.
Awesome. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm going to share my screen and then get started with the presentation. Okay, can you all see that okay? Wonderful, okay. Good afternoon, Mayor and City Councilors. My name is Jen Yildiz Vanderhagen. I'm the Acting Director of the Employee Resource Center. The City's Emergency Management Program is currently housed in the ERC, and our emergency management team has recently gone through a leadership transition, which is why I'm presenting to you today. The purpose of this presentation is to share an overview of the emergency management program and share roles and responsibilities of elected officials during emergencies. Emergency management is a newer industry that is going through tremendous growth and transformation. Across the country, we're seeing that emergency management is growing, redefining the work, and in some cases, rebranding based on what agencies and communities are calling for their emergency management programs. You can see this demonstrated all the way up to FEMA and how emergency response is structured. So over the last 3 years, for example, FEMA has segregated incident command posts in the field from emergency operations centers. And when historically, they have been joined together. This evolution is exciting and offers an opportunity for the city to evaluate how the city's emergency management program can align with community and organizational priorities into the future. The city's emergency management program exists to mitigate, prepare, respond, and recover from emergencies. Mitigation efforts seek to identify and then minimize or eliminate potential risks or threats of disasters by implementing proactive measures before an emergency or disaster occurs. The City of Eugene engages in this work by developing plans like the Natural Hazards Mitigation Plan to identify hazards that may be mitigated, identify proactive actions or solutions, and support city departments in seeking and administering grants or identifying funds to implement these mitigation efforts. An example of mitigation work currently underway is being led by the Fire Marshal's Office. Emergency Management partnered with Eugene Springfield Fire to apply for a grant to write a community wildfire protection plan and update our evacuation routes. The CWPP, which will be an annex to Lane County's Community Wildfire Protection Plan, will include mitigation strategies to protect our community from wildfire risks. Preparedness is a critical function of emergency management and the main focus of this program. A major priority of preparedness work is led by the emergency management team to conduct community outreach and engage and provide education and training to community members about how to prepare for and mitigate the risks for emergency events at an individual, neighborhood, and sometimes regional within our city boundaries level. Preparedness also includes the important work of preparing for city organization for a potential emergency, by establishing continuation of operations plans to ensure that critical services can function in an emergency. Other preparedness efforts include the plans that the city develops and maintains. For example, the Emergency Operations Plan, Natural Hazards Mitigation Plan, and Community Wildfire Protection Plans are examples of the types of plans that we write with the whole community in mind to prepare for a potential disaster or emergency. The city also has plans for fuels mitigation, debris management, and evacuation plans. Each of these plans provide an opportunity to understand threats and outline how we will respond to potential disasters. These plans are made stronger by regularly exercising the plans to ensure that the systems and processes are ready, evaluated, and updated so that we are trained and prepared to respond. Response, as you can imagine, varies greatly depending on the type of emergency or disaster that occurs and how the community has been impacted. As an organization, we have a strong history and robust infrastructure to support centralized emergency management functions when an event calls for this type of response. Most recently, we've responded with a centralized EOC, or Emergency Operations Center, to the COVID-19 pandemic. We also have incredibly talented and capable department operation centers that are utilized to enable emergency services and support critical infrastructure to operate during emergency events. The most recent example of this is how the city responded to the ice storm earlier this year. I'm going to use the ice storm as a way to illustrate how the program and the city organization respond to emergencies. You will recall that Assistant City Manager Matt Rodriguez came to the City Council to provide you with information about how the city responded during the winter weather event. The emergency management team served as a conduit for information between city and regional partners, provided support to partner agencies, and played a critical role in requesting support from the state when needs were brought to the organization. Department operation centers like the RIC at Public Works worked tirelessly to address downed trees, worked to maintain drivable roads so that the emergency services could meet community needs, and support reopening of major systems, including our transportation system, as soon as possible. After any emergency, the organization always conducts debriefs to identify gaps, successes, and proactive work that needs to be done to improve response in the next event. Coming out of the ICE event, the city hosted an internal debrief across departments and participated in debriefs with community partners, including Egan staff and volunteers. Organizational leaders felt proud that they could deliver critical emergency services, support critical infrastructure, including transportation systems, and that the systems that had been developed and exercised worked. As with any debrief process, there were gaps identified, which have surfaced opportunities for the city to engage in proactive conversations and identify strategic work in advance of the next event. A few examples include city leadership plans to have a policy discussion this summer to examine whether or not the organization should revisit the core purpose of our facilities for emergency events, and for example, whether or not we might open them to provide day sheltering. The organization has always operated facilities under standard hours of operations when staffing has allowed. Standard operations have allowed community members to access community centers, libraries, and other city facilities that are open to the public to cool down, access clean air, and even find a warm place to shelter during typical business hours. Another gap that has been identified is that the city does not have a team readily available to respond to day or night sheltering needs for residents during a winter weather event. The city has not historically responded to emergencies by providing this type of response. In fact, many employees who typically support community members accessing shelter or housing needs in a day-to-day capacity are the same people who are called to work to perform emergency response efforts to support critical infrastructure. So recognizing those gaps, we're engaged in thinking about what we might do in the future. The city staff also engaged in 3 debrief meetings with Egan to better understand challenges and that the organization faced in responding to the storm. So those are just examples of how we responded in the last event to talk about how we might implement a response effort. And then the last phase is recovery. Recovery is long-term work that is specific to the emergency that has occurred. Recovery can include making plans for long-term housing and resource needs in the community, engaging in community outreach, managing grants secured during or following the event, and engaging in community partnerships to support the whole community as we recover from a disaster. This slide is really here to highlight the cornerstone of our work, which is preparedness. Preparedness efforts are taken on by city emergency management staff, as well as by the CERT program, which is largely supported by volunteers. Emergency preparedness makes up a significant portion of the work of the emergency management program. Our community resilience in the event of a major emergency is closely tied to how prepared each of us as individuals, households, and neighborhoods are. The emergency management team, in close partnership with city departments and community partners, prioritize reaching community members at neighborhood meetings, community events, and even in care facilities to help people prepare for emergencies. The city provides program coordination and support to the Community Emergency Response Team, CERT, and this is a collaboration between the cities of Eugene and Springfield, where we work together to build a culture of preparedness in our communities. The goal is to increase overall disaster resilience. This is done by providing training and resources to community members. The CERT program educates people about disaster preparedness for hazards that may impact their area and trains them in basic disaster response skills, such as fire safety, light search and rescue, team organization, and disaster medical operations. One important factor in preparation is being aware of potential risks and acting when emergencies impact our area. And one way that every community member can increase their own preparedness is by signing up for lane alerts. Anyone watching now can use the QR code on the slide to sign up for emergency alerts through Lane Alerts. This is a system that enables Lane County residents to receive critical information quickly in a variety of situations, such as severe weather, wildfire, evacuation, and other emergency situations. The emergency management team also amplifies statewide initiatives like Be 2 Weeks Ready and the 12 Ways to Prepare campaigns in the community outreach efforts that they're conducting. This alignment helps emergency preparedness feel approachable and relatable by establishing a shared understanding of warnings and alerts, approaches to individual planning efforts, and guides that make these efforts more accessible. The Be 2 Weeks Ready campaign is a major initiative of the Oregon Department of Emergency Management. Being 2 Weeks Ready calls on individuals, families, and communities to stay aware of potential risks, have an emergency plan, and enough food and water to survive for at least 2 weeks. Community members can access toolkits related to this campaign for Be 2 Weeks Ready online. And these toolkits provide step-by-step units to make this preparedness activity more accessible. Really what's important about this is that being 2 weeks ready as an individual, family, or community can really lessen the strain on emergency responders who will need to be focused on vulnerable populations and injured people in the event of an emergency. There's also 12 Ways to Prepare campaign that FEMA has put out. FEMA has a guide for warnings in addition to that, so that people can start to have a shared understanding about what different warning and alert levels mean. So for example, if an advisory statement is put out, this really means that people should be aware, right, that a hazard is expected to occur in your area or nearby. If a watch is released, this means that as a community, we should be prepared. A hazard may be possible to occur in our area or nearby. And then finally, if a warning is released, this means that we should be ready to take action or taking action. A hazard is expected to occur or is occurring in our area or nearby, and the impact may be serious. And so by being prepared as individuals and also having a shared understanding of the warnings, we can increase our community resilience. We know that the ideas of being prepared can sound overwhelming and even expensive at times. The guides that have been developed by the state and FEMA are tailored so that individual families and individuals themselves can think about how much energy or effort they can put into these types of efforts and how what might be financially feasible for them in an effort to make them scalable and accessible. There are many free resources and guides on the Oregon Department of Emergency Management and FEMA's website. Ultimately, being prepared means three core things: being informed, having an emergency plan, and making an emergency kit. Any preparedness steps people take are important and helpful in building our community resilience. And while city emergency management is out participating in and spreading the word about these important topics, we also know that as elected officials, you're contacted by people as they prepare for or experience emergencies. And I just want to take a moment to thank you for the roles that you play in being conduits of information for constituents, raising questions or concerns to city leadership, and engaging in outreach of your own. Any way that you can amplify these preparedness efforts are appreciated. I'm going to transition now to talking about the specific roles of elected officials during an emergency. FEMA provides great guidance to elected leaders, so I'll provide you with an overview of that information today, as well as share trainings that elected officials can access to deepen or even refresh your understanding. FEMA states that the role of an elected official is to balance many responsibilities and expectations, to serve in numerous roles to support and lead your jurisdiction. To accomplish this, they recommend that the following are considered as it relates to leading communities before, during, and after a disaster. First is to understand potential impacts on the community. Local elected officials should be familiar with the potential impacts of threats and hazards such as floods, storms, earthquakes, and wildfires, as well as less predictable events like active shooters, technology hazards, extended power outages, or cyber incidents. Second is equity considerations. It is vitally important for elected officials to understand the demographic composition within their communities, such as historically underserved populations, individuals with disabilities, and others with access and functional needs, since they may need and require additional assistance during a disaster. And then finally, emergency response. Elected officials typically make key policy decisions and communicate important information during a response. The information on this slide is pulled from the 908 independent study course that FEMA provides, with an overlay of what the city has already put in place in each of these areas and how the organization has delegated authority and responsibility to respond to disasters. These are not new for the city organization or our emergency management program. In fact, under each of the areas, you'll see reference to how we've prepared. These efforts are largely taking place behind the scenes and as part of the foundational history of the emergency management program. I'll go through them at a high level. So the first segment in this training is to understand the emergency management mission. This is really focused on encouraging elected officials to understand the mission of the emergency management program within their organizations. The second is awareness of your authorities. This section is about making sure that elected officials know their roles and responsibilities as well as authorities in responding to an emergency. And I'm going to cover that more in a few slides. Learn about your own team. The city has elected to have an emergency management program and an assigned emergency manager. Knowing the structures, roles, and responsibilities that are listed in the EOP, the Emergency Operations Plan, can help you know when and how to engage. The fourth section of this training is about reviewing your plans and resources. This is really encouraging folks to learn about preparedness, mitigation, and continuity of operations plans so that you can feel more informed about emergency management. 5 is know how to lead during a crisis. A critical component of this section is about knowing how to request federal assistance if we get to a place where that needs to happen, and serving as conduits for accurate and timely information with constituents. And finally, promote preparedness. We've already talked extensively about community preparedness efforts and how elected officials amplifying these messages can help our community prepare for disasters. The 4 phases of emergency management, which are again preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation, really require that we're working in partnership with each of the entities that are listed here. Each entity has a different role to play and depending on the scenario and the phase that we're working in. Importantly, FEMA requires that we plan and respond with a whole community approach. This means that we should be reaching out to and planning with partners to address the needs of the whole community. And that means that we ultimately need to and get to work with all of the people who are listed as cooperators across the community to ensure this holistic approach. Emergency management operates under federal, state, and local frameworks. Having the ordinances listed in place provide a framework for the program and allow us to request reimbursable expenses when there is a federal declaration of an emergency. The city has a number of emergency management ordinances, all listed here on the screen. There's also city code that addresses emergency management. To talk about how the organization will respond in an emergency, it is helpful for us to talk about our emergency operations plan and an emergency operations center. Last promulgated by the City of Eugene in 2023, the EOP, which is short for Emergency Operations Center and how we'll talk about it going forward, outlines the roles and responsibilities of the mayor, city council, and city employees in an emergency. The plan articulates when and how we will respond to emergencies. And you can see on the slide that there are specific requirements for an EOP, including how often it is reviewed and updated. We currently have a shared plan with the city of Springfield, so it's a multi-jurisdictional emergency operations plan. And it also provides us an opportunity, like I talked about before, to really think about providing for our whole community, as well as taking into account access and functional needs planning. In addition to that, it outlines guidelines for activating the Emergency Operations Center, or EOC, for all hazard situations. Now, when we talk about an EOC, the differentiation here is that the EOC is a response tool, or something that is actually outlined in the EOP. And it is a plan. The plan for the EOC outlines the location, people, and tools that the city will use to operate in the case of an emergency. You can see some of the important functions and outlined response on the slide. Let's dive into what the EOP outlines for the mayor, city council, and city manager. For city councilors and the mayor, the EOP states, it is the ultimate responsibility for policy, budget, and political direction for each city government that is borne by the city council. During disasters and emergencies, this responsibility includes encouraging public involvement and assistance, issuing policy statements as needed to support activities or actions and activities of response and recovery efforts, and providing a political contact for the visiting state and federal officials. The EOP specifically outlines the roles of the city councilors and the mayor to be ensure the line of succession, be available to address the community and act as a conduit of communications and support within your respective wards and evacuation centers, review emergency expenditures and ensure adequate appropriation of financial resources to meet emergency expenses, coordinate emergency public information with the city manager's office staff and lead public information officer assigned to the EOC, and finally, meet as needed to provide policy direction and enact ordinances to reduce the impact to residents. Under the EOP, there are also specific responsibilities and roles that are only held by the mayor or the city manager. So I'm going to start with the mayor. First is convene the city council for emergency sessions, assist in communication and coordination efforts with elected officials and other government entities, and recovery, maintaining an active role in supporting community recovery efforts. The city manager has the responsibility to ensure continuity of government and essential services, recommend any ordinances, policies, or procedures to city council and other city officials to assist in their performance of their duties in preventing, protecting against, mitigating, responding to, and recovering from an emergency. Declare a state of emergency, requesting assistance from or through Lane County, the state, and the federal government. And finally, support local government departments and personnel in obtaining resources necessary to continue essential services as needed. I wanted to just call out a little bit more about the declaration of an emergency. So the EOP under the operational annex number 3 lists a process to declare a state of emergency. This is the city manager's role. So there are a couple of steps involved in that. There are a couple of things that need to be true for that to occur. An emergency requires a coordinated response beyond that which occurs routinely. The required response is not achievable solely with the added resources acquired through mutual aid or cooperative assistance agreements. And the emergency consists of a level 3 emergency under the city's emergency management plan. I'm going to take a minute to turn this over to Chief Caven, who's going to be able to share information about what we anticipate as we think about potential upcoming emergencies as fire season approaches. Chief Caven.
All right, thank you. Let me know if for some reason the sound gets wonky. I'm in the Dulles Airport. So if it gets noisy, I'll try to find a different spot. But, you know, as we work on this year's fire season, the preseason forecast that we got was that overall it would be kind of an average to potentially slightly above average wildfire season for us in Oregon. We've come out of the long-term drought when we look on the west side of the Cascades that we'd experienced over the last several years. However, that being said, we have 3 large wildfires on the landscape right now with I think the biggest one just popped up yesterday afternoon, and by this morning was already 2,400 acres running along the south and east of the Pine, which the governor declared an emergency conflagration act. So, you know, the preseason fire predictions are important. They help us guide and understand, but they're not necessarily a predictor of year over year what exactly is the fire season going to turn out for us. The Applegate fire, which is down in southern Oregon right now, that required additional task forces to support, that occurred while that ODF jurisdiction was moving from low fire danger to only moderate fire danger. And so it's just important to understand we have a lot of fuel. We've had a long-term droughts. That wildfire can be a real risk. When we look back to 2020, it too was a pretty unremarkable fire season throughout. But one significant weather event really drove that into large-scale community disaster. And so regardless what the forests say, regardless of what the long-term forecasts say, you know, we prepare and make sure that we're ready and our communities are ready, and we're watching any significant weather events that move in. I think one thing that's important, you'll see, we haven't yet experienced red flag warning in our area. This fire season, there is red flag warnings east of the Cascades. When we see significant or community devastating large-scale wildfires, for the most part, those occur on extreme fire weather days, which means kind of the combination of all the significant events: extremely low humidity, high winds, and high temperatures. Fortunately, that happens less frequently, but it's a threat that we, again, were prepared for. When we look back to just last fire season, it was July 3rd that we experienced the Moon Mountain fire, the fire that we had been planning for in our South Hills fire plan for the better part of the last 25 years. Fortunately, that fire did occur early on in the season, so the rate of fire spread, wind direction, overall heat wasn't as big of an issue to that outcome. However, as soon as we arrived on scene, we started the notification process to the city manager and subsequently down to elected officials should we need that support, and ultimately to declare a state of emergency. In that case, we were able to leverage the more recent Senate Bill 762, which Chief Heppel and others worked on following the 2020 wildfires, that provided an enhanced response network, meaning we were able to access statewide resources to support the response to the Moon Mountain fire without formally declaring a state of emergency. And those resources were still paid for by the state of Oregon. Why that was important for us was not that we could not handle that fire. It was really that there was a high risk the next day with the lowering humidities, the high wind, that it was really going to test our lines, and we knew with the 4th of July holiday, might not be prepared with enough resources to handle that, just given the fact that our regular call load within the city sees us with very few available resources throughout the peak hours of the day. So with that, as we move in, there's lots of resources that are accessed if you're curious and want to follow along. There's a good app that I think the entire community probably has because we get questions about it, called Watch Duty. And you're able to track wildfires pretty much across the West Coast. So That's one it'll send you alerts when they pop up. You have real situational awareness of what's going on, and the community finds it very valuable because that is another tool that they're able to receive updates and information and evacuation planning. So that's kind of the status of the fire situation as it stands right now. Again, wildfire it's going to be here regardless of what we do. Our wildfire mitigation program is really starting to get spun up, and we're working on the partnerships to help prevent these fires. If we can do that, then we don't need you all to be as engaged in declaring an emergency and keeping your constituents aware. So that's what I've got.
Thank you. So just to close this out, I wanted to provide a list of trainings available to elected officials. In addition to these offerings, we'd be really happy to have our emergency management team, once we're through this transition, meet with elected officials and even newly elected officials to share and provide these types of resources and talk about the structure of the program. Thank you for the opportunity to present today, Mayor. I will hand it back to you for discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. That is a huge amount of information for us to sort of absorb in a brief period of time. And I just want to, we did come through COVID, and we have come through an ice storm, and we have come through wildfires. And so thankfully it's a lot of information, but we actually have learned a lot, and it's more familiar to us than it would have been otherwise. And I remember in 2019 that I convened a summit for mayors in Lane County because I was worried that we weren't all sort of on the same page, and that an emergency would happen, and people would be pointing at each other saying, "I thought you were going to do that part." And I feel that we're clearly not in that place and don't have to worry about that. And so appreciate all of that. And then I also very much appreciate that, certainly when COVID hit, that it was a huge learning curve for us to figure out, especially as elected officials, I think, what our role is and how to be effective. So thank you for all of this work. It was a great presentation. And I have Matt has had his hand up for a long time. So Matt, and then Randy.
Thanks, Mayor. I initially popped my hand up when we were talking about the lane alert system, and apologies to colleagues. My camera's not operating, so I'm just audio only today. In regards to the lane alert, and thank you for this opportunity to even have this emergency preparedness conversation. And let me please make clear that if there are any trainings available, sign me up, whether they're in person or virtual or both. I'd want to participate in all of the above that was presented today, and I would very much like an in-person. I'd like to request an in-person walkthrough of our new City Hall facility for staff and elected officials, should we be present in the event that there's an emergency at City Hall. Going back to lane alert, my question is, because of how critically important that alert system is, I'm curious as to what percentage of our community are signed up, A, and B, if we can't explore an automatic opt-in through the utility that has an opt-out option to bring more community members into the fold who may have some technological hurdles or may just not be aware of how important the lane alert system is.
Thank you for those questions, Councillor Keating. Lane alerts is run through Lane County, so I'll follow up with their emergency manager, Tiffany Brown, to ask some of those questions and be able to follow up with you later.
Great, thank you.
Okay, Randy.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Jennifer and Chief Caven. I appreciate the presentation. Just confirming, Jennifer, I think you said the emergency plan was last updated in 2023. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, great. I want to specifically get into accessing additional resources as we start seeing that we're going to go through everything that we have here locally and even through our mutual aid. specifically around the federal government, the Stafford Act. And I know that that was amended in 2019, but I don't know the changes. Is our pathway still the same, Chief?
Yeah, so the structure that we would go to, let's say, whether it's wildfire or a significant the dams issue, you name it, any number of the things in our hazard mitigation program are going to come through right there. The first response aspect that we have, the establishment of the citywide EOC, so we're coordinating information. That will engage city manager when it comes time to potentially engage the mayor, then to the state EOC, and then really or through the county to the state, which will then determine let's say we've tapped our enhanced mutual aid resources that exist through Senate Bill 762, which are not just wildfire. We could call for them in an all hazards type incident if we need responders on the ground. Once we've exceeded that, and if let's say there's a number of large scale issues, or Cascadia, where Oregon is challenged in a number of different regions, and the state is depleted, then they would make that request for federal resources through the EMAC. So for the most part, little has changed other than communications and coordination.
So it's still local. Well, in fire's case, it'd be you to the Lane County Fire Defense Board chief, to the state, then to Region 10 for FEMA. If we were declaring a fire emergency, we would need to work through the Lane County Fire Defense Board, but not for the greater disaster declaration. That's what I'm trying to delineate the difference. So for the greater disaster declaration, that's still through the city manager, but it still goes city manager. Does it bypass the county then and go to the state?
I believe we still have to route or involve the county in our declaration.
I know we need to involve them in the declaration, but it's more working together as opposed to directing the request to the county, to the state, to the feds. Okay. And there's not a role for elected officials in that. Is that correct?
Not that I'm aware of. The city manager might correct me on that one, but I believe it's delegated to her.
It makes more sense that the staff would handle it, but I just wanted to confirm. That's always been a little bit fuzzy. We were even when I was chief, I'd ask that question, and it was kind of, well, we certainly want to involve them, and I go, yeah, but who asks the question? And I think those pathways, it's really important that those are crystal clear, because you don't have time to dance around when your world's falling apart. So that's important to me to know that. Maybe somebody could get back to me on that. I'd appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Are there other counselors with questions or comments? Lindsay.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, staff and everyone who presented. My question is, do we have a communication platform that we will be able to use in an emergency situation to communicate with constituents, or is it going to be just into the hands of the county?
Do you mean for the Lane Alert system?
Yeah, I mean, one of the roles that was indicated was that we would be available to speak to our constituents and to respond. But obviously I'm hoping to access those trainings that you listed, but that our ability to communicate with the entirety of our wards, for example, is very limited.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question, Councillor Leach. I think that it is going to be so specific based on the type of event that we're experiencing, right? What communication tools are available to us and how we might be able to support you all in reaching constituents. So we can do some work to think about what options and access points we have for communication for city councilors specifically. One of the things that I'll say, though, is that we have a really strong relationship with the county's emergency manager. Certainly, if we needed to send an alert out, though it's their program, they would support us in sending that type of alert to our community specifically. What I'm not as familiar with is how specific the zones can be, and if we could specify a zone as a ward for those types of communications. So those are some of the things I need to follow up on.
Great. When I was an intern at the Belize Embassy, the U.S. Embassy, we did some simulations of emergency situations of natural disasters. I feel like it would be extremely beneficial to our city to be able to run a simulation so that we can work on some of these things that we're talking about. What are our roles and how do we operate and how do we communicate? And is that a possibility for us to plan or schedule?
Manager, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I was just raising my hand because, as you all know, I'm in the middle of conducting a series of interviews for my annual performance evaluation. And one of my stakeholders was Frank Lawson, general manager of eWeb. And we actually had a conversation about the possibility. We have not, like, it was just he and I, so this is news to everybody else. The possibility of doing a sort of tabletop simulation exercise with both of our elected bodies together, either, you know, as observers or participants. So it's very fresh, but just so you know, I'm also thinking about that. So more to come on that.
Excellent. And then you addressed the kind of Egan Center staffing as one of the challenges. And I think it would be great if we could have a bigger conversation around what that looks like in an emergency. Like you said, same people who operate the center on a day-to-day basis during cold weather are the ones that will be running it in a disaster situation as well. And as we saw in the ice storm, the volunteers that were there were extremely strained in terms of, you know, many of them there working for 16 hours straight as a volunteer. And, you know, if we're talking about seriously the life and safety and health of our community members in those situations, having a staffing plan or a greater plan to ensure that that's not going to happen again. So if we can have, another conversation around that, I would appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, I'm waiting to see if anyone else raises a hand. Lindsay spoke to, I was happy to see your comments about Egan and following up with them. And I would just say that I think it would be helpful to know a little bit more about that plan before we hit the cold weather again. So maybe just the timing on that would be helpful to council to know what might be planned, you know, by Thanksgiving or so. Thank you for that. Emily.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. This is a really complicated subject. So I'm grateful for the deeper dives that you're doing, because I certainly couldn't. And I'm very grateful for the support that you can change your response and is new to the situation and then help guide us through what needs to be done. I agree with Matt that I think trainings would be great, and with Lindsay about a simulation. First on my list, though, is that I'm really happy to hear that we might expand the use of city buildings for especially Egan, but also heat and smoke. We have a lot of resources that we don't use, and I think a big part is staffing. So anything we could do to encourage, help, increase the staff for Egan would be great. I'd love to see us take rain into consideration, because 34 in rain is worse than 28 in snow because it's drier. I'm grateful to CERT, and I really hope we could expand that. It's a really good way for neighbors to get to know each other. The preparedness plan for the neighborhoods, I don't know how many groups are doing that. But I found neighbors often don't know neighbors in the city, and that's something that in an emergency, we're going to get to know each other fast. So wouldn't it be great to know that? So yeah, thank you for thinking about the winter sooner than later. I'm really grateful to you. This is complex, and if something happens, I'm not going to say when. This is reassuring. Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments or questions from counselors? Mike, and then Randy, I'll give you a second round.
Thank you, Mayor. I just as a specific question, I know it's not my role to get down into the weeds here about the details of this, but I wondered out of curiosity. Obviously, in your presentation, you were talking about a whole community approach of everybody being involved in all the jurisdictions in any kind of discussions and planning. To what degree are the school districts involved would be a question I'd have too. Just in that, I know that the emergency second source water supply is to some degree planned for wells at school district buildings and locations and that sort of thing. Can you talk more about integrating their facilities in potential response and what kind of role they play in the discussions?
Sure. Thank you, Councilor Clark. One of the things that I did was just pull up that slide and realized we didn't have school districts listed as cooperators, but certainly they are cooperators as we think about planning. And so the coordination between the school's emergency management teams and ours are really important as we think about that whole community approach. And also as we think about different sites that people may turn to in an emergency to access different types of resource or information. So as the ERC director, I'm not familiar with all of the details about how those communications and partnerships work. I know that they are in existence and something that I'm sure we could benefit from growing even further. And I can follow up with more information about that later.
Hey, thank you. Randy and then Matt.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to add in a piece that prompted my memory when Councilor Leach was talking about tabletop exercise or an exercise of sorts, which is a great idea. The Emergency Management Institute, EMI, which is housed on the National Fire Academy campus, they bring in whole counties of leadership with the cities and the counties, and they have a week-long course back at EMI that then is partnered with National Fire Academy Executive Fire Officer Program for managing major emergencies. And they put those two together. And so they're using basically our procedures, our policies, and you get real-time exercises that you're running through that go on for long periods of time, and you really get a good feel for how this thing works. And the nice thing is, if I remember correctly, and if they still do it this way, it's pretty much federally funded, but it's they have a multi-million-dollar simulator back there that is resources we just wouldn't have here for a tabletop. And to develop that core level of skill and understanding, at the department head level up, and then, handful of elected officials that go back, it could really serve us well for an eventual event. So I just wanted to float that out there. Thank you.
Yeah, Jen, do you want to respond to that?
Sure, thank you. I just wanted to share that the county actually had an opportunity to take a group of people from our region to EMI. Time is escaping me. So last year or the year before, and the city had an opportunity to send participants through that program. And so I appreciate the idea. I don't think we were able to send elected officials, at least not to my knowledge, from any of the entities, but it is something we could explore further. I think it was a very valuable exercise.
Even there were, when I went through that on the fire side, there were elected officials there, and then there was a big debrief where everybody was brought together. You're not even in the same area, you're in different buildings, but that's part of the point. You're having to communicate. And anyway, it was really eye-opening. I know for the staff that were coming that weren't fire people, because we operate the same way pretty much regardless of what it is. But it just hearing some of the comments by some of the paid staff, appointed staff, and the elected officials of what they didn't know and what they learned was pretty impressive. So that's why I bring it up. But again, it's been a lot of years since I was there doing it, so I don't know how much it's changed, whether it's gotten better, fallen off, or even still. It sounds like it still exists, but it's just something that might be worth looking into, especially if it's revenue backed. Thank you.
Chief, did you also want to respond to that?
Yeah, I was just going to throw out real quick. The county's just reset their team. Obviously, there's going to be some changes in the future in our team. One of the core components of your Office of Emergency Management in the FEMA structure, right, is your training and exercise coordinator, the person who's responsible for planning, documenting, and supporting that. And so I would anticipate as we refill that cup, as the county refills theirs, which we just got to meet them during a multi-agency wildfire tabletop last week, which included EWEB and many other partners. That stuff is building its way back as we've had a number of changes at the county and citywide levels. So.
Thank you for that. Matt.
Thanks, Mayor. As the conversation about communicating with constituents in a time of emergency evolved, it dawned on me that the challenges associated with that, when we don't have the ability, we as city councilors, to my knowledge, don't have the ability to communicate with our constituents when it's not an emergency. There's no platform that I'm aware of that the city uses that allows for us as elected officials to communicate via email to our constituents broadly, or communicate telephonically or via text with our constituents. Now, we certainly can and do on the campaign side, but on the official side, I'm unaware of a platform that we use and would love to have access to such a platform. And I wonder if the county does have a platform that they're using either for emergency or non-emergency communications with constituents.
Councillor Keating, I'm not familiar with whether or not the county has a platform like that, but certainly that can be part of the follow-up I do with Tiffany Brown, their emergency manager, and then can follow up with you. Thank you for the question.
Great, thank you.
Chief?
I would throw out that both of us have access on the emergency communication side. Obviously, that's one-way communications, and in some cases limited by character because we're limited by carrier and the type of cell phones that exist. But both our own, the Central Lane Communications 911 Center, has the capability to send out community emergency notifications. The Best Interest, which they use, Everbridge, it's the same thing the county uses. But again, as that scales up, we can get a notification out quickly through Central Lane. If they can't coordinate with the county ahead of time, 99% of the time they're coordinating with the county when we request those notifications to go out, and the county is actually the one who delivers the message to the subscribers. And in kind of that worst case scenario, if we had to do like the Amber Alert, take over your phone, that technology exists as well. But again, you're very limited to what you can tell them. Usually it's, ready, set, go in the evacuation levels, or go now and go east, go west. It's not really built out to VA, go a specific direction. That's where app-based programs and kind of the evolving emergency management communications space, which continues to expand year over year, becomes more relevant. But you do have to get community members to subscribe, download, and have the app that gives them the more true information, up to and including routing you to your evacuation zone, your sheltering site, you name it. But on a very specific emergency basis, it does exist. Thanks.
Thank you. That was really a helpful response on all levels. I wanted to just chime in and actually appreciate Mike Clark's comments about the schools, because I have really, since I took office in 2017, have talked about the neighborhood schools as, even in a Cascadia event, people can usually walk to a neighborhood school. And so if there's water and power at all of the neighborhoods, I know 4J's been working on it, but I also think food pantries, because especially when we have people living in apartments, they can't store 2 weeks worth of food in their apartments. They don't have a way of doing that. And so I would just love to see that sort of added to the top of the list of, even if it's bottled water and not a well at a school district, that we begin to work with them on, how they could store that kind of supply for people. We have a lot of people living pretty close to the bone poverty level here. They can't buy lots of food. They can't store it. And I'm much more worried about them than I am those of us in this room who are living in houses and, have garages and basements and, can fend for ourselves for a while. So just my 2 cents there. Are there other questions or comments from council? This is so much to absorb, but I think that you're definitely hearing interest, that we're grateful to be hearing this. We're eager to hear more. I think counselors in general are eager to participate in trainings as much as possible and be really clear on their role. I love the idea of a simulation, one or more simulations. But again, realize that we as a city have come through a couple of pretty big crises just in the time that Sarah has been city manager. She's really learned the ropes. So we're not starting from nothing here. We've got a lot to build on, a lot of experience, and so appreciate all of that. And if there are no other questions, I think we are adjourned a little bit early. So thank you very, very much for a terrific conversation.